On our last episode, Jason Statham touched the vault and unlocked a frozen version of himself. Not a clone, not a copy, the original. But as the cryo-unit hissed open, the voice in his head didn't say welcome. It whispered one command: replace. Now Jason's body is trembling, his memories colliding, and the figure in the container is beginning to breathe. But he's not the only one waking up. Somewhere deeper in the forest, the facility is turning on, and not all of them will survive the hour. Jason Statham didn't move. The wind slid across the high plateau, dragging thin frost over the stones and brushing past the open container where the younger version of him, eyes still closed, took his first slow breath in 16 years. The world didn't crack open. It just held its breath. The words still echoed in Jason's mind like gunshots on repeat. "You're not the original." And beside the vault, Ekko didn't step forward to explain. She didn't gloat. She didn't retreat. She just watched, waiting to see which version of Jason would survive the realization. Jason blinked. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from something deeper. The voice was still whispering inside him, not as memory but as command. In the mobile command trailer, Clemens adjusted her headset and stared at the neural feed. Jason's pattern was fragmenting, not dying, not hallucinating, splitting. Left brain rejecting the message, right brain accepting it. Identity fracture. Exactly what they'd coded into E5. The tech turned pale. He's going to overwrite. Clemens didn't answer. She watched the younger Jason's biometric signature begin to spike inside the container. And then it dropped. The younger version's eyes shot open. They didn't scan or blink. They locked straight onto the standing Jason, like they had never stopped looking at him, like this had only been a pause between thoughts. Jason stumbled back, boots grinding against the frost. He raised one hand, slow, unsure of what he was reaching for, his weapon or the truth. The younger Jason stepped out. No clothes, no emotion, muscles leaner, eyes colder. He didn't speak. Jason did. "Who are you?" But the younger version didn't respond. He looked down at the ground, then up at the sky. Then pointed. Jason turned his head, just in time to see a flare rise over the western tree line. Bright red. Someone had triggered the fracture protocol. At the cabin, Sima saw it too. She grabbed Langley's book, clutching it tight to her chest. The other kids froze. No one knew what the flare meant, but they all felt it. She didn't explain. She just started running. Toward Jason. Ekko stepped between the two Jasons, not in fear, but as if she were the only one who understood what came next. She placed her hand gently on the younger Jason's shoulder. And Jason saw something he couldn't explain. The younger version flinched. Not violently, not defensively. Humanly. Jason's mind spun. This wasn't a programmed response. This wasn't AI or mimic code. The younger one didn't know why he was awake. Ekko whispered something to him. Jason couldn't hear it. But it calmed the copy. And that made it worse. Because why would the original need calming down? In a secure chamber miles beneath the mountain, a single door unsealed for the first time in 14 years. Inside were 6 chairs. 5 were empty. The 6th began to recline as Unit R2 activated. Inside that body was another Jason, the reactionary build. Built not to replace E5, but to suppress both him and the original if either went rogue. Now all 3 were active, and only one would be allowed to remain. Jason paced backward from the plateau, hands up, eyes darting between Ekko and his younger self. The cold didn't register anymore. He finally said it out loud. "If I'm not the first, why do I remember things he does?" Ekko turned slowly. "Because memories don't prove identity, they prove intention." Jason clenched his fists. "What does that even mean?" But before she could answer, the tree line exploded. Flashes of movement of black-suited agents, not from Clemens's team. They weren't there to observe, they were there to extract. Jason ducked low, rolled behind a boulder and reached for his old sidearm, but the holster was missing. The younger Jason didn't move. He just watched them come. And Ekko. She pulled her blade. She was ready. Gunfire cracked across the stones. Ekko moved like shadow, slicing behind the first agent before his trigger could rise. Jason swept a loose pipe from the frost and charged forward. The younger Jason didn't join in. He simply walked forward. Bullets curved, missing him by inches. They weren't targeting him. Jason noticed too late. The agents weren't there to stop the vault from opening. They were there to kill Jason, the one outside the chamber. Ekko caught one of them mid-strike and threw his body against a rock. Jason disarmed another, but not before taking a blade across the shoulder. Blood sprayed, he dropped to one knee. The younger Jason stood still. Then finally he spoke. "They're not after me, they're after you." Jason spat blood. "I noticed." Ekko moved fast, grabbing Jason under the arm and dragging him behind a metal ridge. He pressed against the wall, breath shallow, blood dripping into the snow. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "We're both awake now, aren't we?" Ekko said nothing. The younger Jason was walking away. Toward the flare's origin. Jason called out, voice cracked. "Where are you going?" The younger one turned just slightly. "To remember who I am." Down in the mountainside vault, Clemens watched the feed blank. The neural sync had snapped. All three signals, Jason, E5, and R2, had disconnected. It meant the protocol had succeeded. It also meant none of them were under control anymore. She leaned forward, eyes wide, voice tight. "Pull the Blacksay team, everyone now." The tech stammered, "We'll lose tracking." Clemens whispered, "We already did." Jason leaned back against the rock wall, clutching his arm. Ekko crouched beside him, wiping blood off his face. She said something, but he couldn't hear it over the ringing in his ears. He looked up at the sky. The flare was fading. But now the stars weren't right. They weren't stars. They were beacons. Old military satellites from the Omega era. And one of them had just shifted orientation. Jason looked at Ekko. "Did you see that?" She nodded. "It's not over." Jason pulled himself up. "No, it's just starting." Jason Statham moved through the pine-blasted gully like a hunted man wearing someone else's skin. Ekko followed close behind, her blade still drawn, but now tucked low against her hip. The wound on Jason's shoulder had dried into his shirt, but the ache pulsed with every step, not just from the injury, from the fracture in his mind. The plateau behind them was silent. The younger Jason, the original or something close to it, had disappeared into the forest, walking toward the flare like it was home. But it wasn't the flare that haunted Jason. It was the satellite shift. A signal had been received. And he knew the Omega satellites weren't just observation. They were response systems. 10 kilometers east, a dormant radio tower clicked to life for the first time since 2011. Snow slid off its old dish as it turned toward the western range. Inside the mountain, Unit R2, Jason's failsafe copy, was already moving through the decommissioned tram tunnels, fully armed, fully activated. He wasn't heading for the flare. He was heading for the signal source, Jason himself. There was only room for one operating signature. Only one code could remain in the system. Jason stopped when he heard boots behind him, more than echoes. They both dropped behind a fallen tree just as a squad of 6 Blacksay hunters moved through the trees. Their rifles weren't up. They were searching. Ekko leaned in. "Not local," she whispered. Jason studied their gear. No logos, but the boots, foreign military issue, not US. They weren't here for Omega. They were here for what Omega buried. He motioned to move wide, flank them, but Ekko shook her head. And then Jason saw what she saw. One of the agents was dragging a body, wrapped in thermal foil. Jason's eyes narrowed. The body was still breathing. They followed the squad for a full kilometer until the group stopped in a clearing, an old listening post Jason remembered from a Cold War training op. The underground bunker had been stripped clean years ago, but the hatch was open again. Inside the bunker, Jason saw movement, a boy's hand reaching up weakly from the edge of a stretcher. It was Ekko's brother, the same one she'd sworn was dead. Ekko stepped forward without warning, her knife glinted. Jason grabbed her arm. "Not yet." But she was shaking. "Not dead," she muttered. Jason didn't stop her, he moved with her. They hit the bunker fast, Jason dropping 2 with blunt strikes while Ekko went for the lead officer. A short, vicious fight. Clean, tactical. By the time the dust settled, 3 agents were down and the other 3 had bolted into the trees. Ekko ran to the stretcher. The boy's face was pale, but his eyes opened as she touched his cheek. She froze. Jason stepped closer. But the boy didn't say her name. he said. Statham. Jason stared. You know me. The boy nodded. They said you'd come. At the black site, Dr. Clemens watched the recon drone feeds flicker with static. One of the satellites had begun deploying subroutines not seen since the Montenegro incident. It meant only one thing. Omega wasn't trying to extract anymore. It was preparing for a reset. She keyed into command. Fracture is no longer containable, requesting permission to initiate Ghost Protocol. The voice on the other end was silent for 5 full seconds. Then came the answer, denied, observe only. Clemens swore under her breath. Jason helped the boy sit up slowly. His body was weak, trembling from whatever chemicals they'd used to keep him under, but his memory was sharp. They used my voice to control the other units, the boy whispered. I didn't know what I was saying, they made me say it. Ekko clenched her jaw. She was holding back tears, but Jason was already thinking 4 steps ahead. How many units? The boy looked at him. They said there were 4 operational, 1 just woke up. Jason's pulse jumped. 4 versions. So far they'd seen 2, himself and the original. Now R2 was on the move. And there was 1 more. They moved the boy into a makeshift sled and began dragging him across the snow toward a safer ridge. But night was crawling in, fast and sharp, and the sky had started to hum, low, metallic, almost like pressure on the back of the neck. Jason stopped mid-step and looked up. The stars were tracking. Not visually but aligned, 4 lights, 4 positions. And now they weren't stars. They were orbital weapon drones. The Omega system wasn't just waking up units, it was aiming. Ekko whispered, they're targeting identities. Jason turned. What? Each drone tracks a neural ID signature, that's why they're circling. Jason looked back at the boy. Do you have a signature? He shook his head. They erased mine. Jason nodded. Ekko asked, what about you? Jason didn't answer. Because he already knew. He was the anchor ID. Every Omega trigger depended on his signal to activate. If they killed him, the system would collapse. But if he killed the others first, he could shut it down. Behind them, a rumble cracked through the trees. Ekko turned. Jason didn't need to look. It was R2. The 4th version hadn't arrived yet, but the enforcer was already on the ground, hunting. Jason whispered, move. They dragged the boy across the snow into the ravine below, just as a flash of blue light burst behind them, a sonic marker. R2 had pinged their position. Jason stopped short at the edge of the drop. He turned to Ekko. This ends before the 4th wakes up. She didn't argue. Jason handed her the sled rope. I'm going back. Ekko reached for his arm. You're not ready. Jason met her eyes. I was never the original, but I'm the only one still choosing what happens next. He turned and walked back into the trees. As the sky above began to glow, Jason Statham moved like a ghost between the trees, body low, steps silent, every instinct locked to the pulse of the hunt. He was bleeding, his mind fracturing under truth and betrayal, but none of that mattered now. R2 had been released. The Omega satellites were tracking neural signatures, and somewhere out here, the last version was waking. Jason didn't know who he was hunting anymore himself, or the thing they made in his image. The snow had stopped falling, but the air carried an electric charge. Something was watching. He adjusted his grip on the blade Ekko had slipped him before he left. It wasn't just for survival. It was for identity. On a distant ridge, R2 stood completely still. He wasn't moving like a soldier. He was listening to the trees, to the satellites above, to the resonance of the neural net now collapsing around them. Then he moved, not toward Jason, but toward the bunker. He was going for the boy. Ekko didn't wait. She pulled the sled harder, moving through the rock cleft to a narrow path she remembered from her recon years, a forgotten communications trench that led behind the comms tower ruins. The boy was whispering things again, random phrases. Not in fear, but like he was reading code aloud. Ekko looked down. Where did you learn that? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked up at her and smiled faintly. They left one more inside. Ekko stopped cold. What? The boy's voice was clear now. They didn't just make you watch, Ekko. They made one of you too. Jason reached the coordinates burned into his memory, the first fireline drill site from the Montenegro War Games. It was a place only he knew, a ghost zone. But someone was already there. The flare on the ground pulsed red. Static flickered from a device embedded in the soil. Jason stepped closer and saw a voice recorder blinking. He picked it up. Hit play. A voice spoke. They told you R2 was the failsafe. He's not, you are. Jason staggered back. Another voice played his own. You volunteered for fracture. That's why you're breaking. That's why they're hunting. Jason crushed the recorder under his boot. This wasn't memory. It was programmed guilt. Back in the ravine, Ekko heard the first shot. Not close, but not far. She grabbed the sled rope and ran. Behind her, the boy whispered again, "Don't let him see the girl in the mirror." Ekko didn't ask, she just ran faster. Because some truths should stay buried. Jason reached the bunker and saw the door open. No lights, no guards. Just darkness. He moved slow, blade drawn, senses wide. Inside, the air changed, colder, cleaner. He stepped onto a grated floor and turned a corner. And stopped. There was a mirror. Not a reflection, a projection. His face split down the middle, one half smiling, the other scarred. A voice played again. Not a recording. Real time. Jason Statham has arrived. Command code, SD8 fragment detected. Initiating collapse sequence. A panel slid open. A chamber rose. Inside, not a Jason. A girl. 13, eyes open, wires plugged into her spine. She looked at him like she'd seen him in her dreams. She whispered one word. Dad. Jason fell to his knees. He didn't know her face, but something in him cracked. She looked like someone who once mattered. Like the past he'd buried wasn't actually past. He reached forward, hand trembling. But before he could touch her, everything shook. R2 hit the ground above them like a missile, ripping open the ceiling, boots crashing through stone and steel. Jason dove, pulling the girl behind him. R2 dropped in a blur of muscle and gunmetal, scanning, targeting. Jason rose, bloodied, broken, blade in hand. He didn't speak. Neither did R2. They just moved. It wasn't a fight, it was collapse. R2 moved faster, hit harder, but Jason didn't stop. Every strike was a question, who am I? Every counter was an answer, I choose who I am. The bunker exploded with motion, metal slamming, dust rising, bones cracking. Jason pinned R2 against the wall, only to be flipped, choked, slammed. The girl screamed. Ekko was still too far. Jason reached for the detonator on his belt, backup kill switch. But it was gone. R2 had removed it before they started. This wasn't about death. It was about memory. Jason gasped, one hand pressed against the control node as R2 bore down on him. And then a shock. From the system. The girl had touched the terminal. Code burst across the wall like wildfire. The control system shifted. R2 froze just for a second. Jason lunged. Blade out. Straight into the neural jack at the base of R2's skull. The enforcer dropped. Twitching, not dead, but overwritten. Jason collapsed to his knees again. Breathing hard. Ekko arrived seconds later. She saw the girl first, then Jason. Then the R2 unit still shaking. Jason looked up, eyes glazed. She called me Dad. Ekko stepped forward. She's the last one, they kept her for leverage. Jason whispered, or maybe she's the first. The lights in the bunker flickered. The satellites were still tracking. One more version was waking. And this one wasn't on land. Thousands of miles above Earth, one of the orbital systems began to glow brighter than the others. It didn't move like a drone. It moved like it was thinking. Inside, a frozen chamber cracked. Not a man, not a woman. A hybrid. Built from all four. The original mind was Jason S. But the body, something else. Jason rose slowly and looked at Ekko. She's coming. Ekko looked back at the girl. She's not ready. Jason checked the blade, looked at R2's crumpled form. No one is.